He had come to Denali for connection, not conquest. No weapon, no bravado, just a lens and a deep hunger for something real. But the wild does not negotiate with human hope. It doesn't reward sentiment. In the wilderness, respect must be paired with caution, and awe must never erase preparedness. Richard's final photographs captured not just the majesty of Denali, but the moment when admiration stepped too close to danger. Richard White was 49 years old, a quiet, disciplined man with a deep reverence for nature and a camera that rarely left his side. From his home base in San Diego, California, Richard spent decades exploring the untamed stretches of the American West. He walked alone, always on foot, never chasing danger or glory. For him, the wilderness wasn't about thrill or conquest. It was about humility, about silence, about remembering that he was just a visitor in a world older, stronger, and more mysterious than most people cared to admit. He wasn't the kind of man who climbed peaks to post about them later. Richard didn't care for likes or loud gear or sponsorships. To him, being in the wild was a sacred act, like entering a cathedral built by time. His friends described him as methodical, even obsessive. He mapped every route, studied the weather like a scientist, and memorized the feeding cycles and migration habits of the animals he might encounter. But Richard didn't just photograph nature, he listened to it, believed in it. He had trekked alone through Yellowstone, Glacier, and the Sierra Nevada. But in August of 2012, he set his sights on a place wilder than anything he'd faced before. Denali National Park in Alaska, towering across more than 6 million acres, larger than the entire state of Massachusetts, Denali is a place of overwhelming extremes. Craggy peaks, sprawling valleys, icy rivers, and thick forests. But unlike other national parks, Denali is home to over 300 grizzly bears, roaming free without boundaries. It's not a park for casual hikers or tourists with packed lunches. Denali is the real deal. It's the last frontier where nature holds the upper hand. And it doesn't care if you're ready or not. But Richard wasn't there for danger. He came for solitude, for stillness. He carried no gun, no hiking partner, no satellite phone. Just a backpack, a tent, his camera, and a small leather-bound journal. In it, park rangers later found a single haunting line, hoping to capture something true. He stepped into the backcountry alone, unaware that something in that vast and ancient wilderness was already aware of him, watching, breathing, waiting. On the morning of August 19th, the park shuttle rolled deeper into Denali, leaving behind the last traces of paved road. Dust swirled beneath the tires, and Richard sat silently with a folded map in his lap and his camera bag at his side. He had just finished the required safety briefing at the visitor center. Rangers covered the basics. Secure your food, pitch camp at safe distances, stay alert. But one instruction was emphasized above all: carry bear spray, and use it if you have to. Richard listened. He nodded. He signed the forms, but he didn't bring any. Whether he forgot it, underestimated the risk, or simply chose to rely on instinct, no one would ever know. And when he stepped off that shuttle near the Toklat River, miles from the nearest ranger post, he entered the Alaskan wilderness with no real means of protection. His assigned destination was Unit 10, a remote and rugged zone near the Toklat River. It was wide, exposed, and known for frequent grizzly sightings. Most hikers avoided it, but for Richard, that isolation was the point. He didn't want paved trails or guideposts. He wanted presence, that raw, unfiltered pulse of a land that hadn't been tamed. He cinched his pack, adjusted the straps, and disappeared into the bush. There was no cell signal, no radio, no satellite beacon. Just him, a lens, a canvas of sky, and the rhythmic crunch of boots against soil. Over the next few days, Richard traveled deeper into the backcountry, pitching his tent in high, quiet places and recording cloud shapes, bird calls, and weather changes in his journal. Nothing unusual, no fear, no mention of unease. But what Richard didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that a full-grown male grizzly had been moving through the same valleys, untracked, unbothered, free. In that part of the park, with no crowds or cameras, the bear had no reason to retreat. There were no boundaries, no barriers, just instinct. And when the paths of man and beast finally crossed, it wasn't with tension or ceremony. It was fast, brutal, final. There were no warning roars, no slow approach, no cinematic chase, just the raw, explosive power of a wild animal defending its domain. No one was there to see what happened. No one to hear the final moments. The sounds, if there were any, were swallowed by the silence of Denali. Whatever took place was erased by wind, trees, and time. On August 24th, 5 days after Richard vanished, the air along the Toklat River was thick and unmoving. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the gravel bar. That's where rangers eventually found signs: disturbed brush, scattered gear, and tracks far too large to belong to any human. Somewhere near that bend in the river, Richard had likely paused, maybe to photograph the way light shimmered off the water. That's when he saw it. About 50 yards ahead, just beyond a gentle rise in the terrain, an adult male grizzly bear stood near the water's edge. Its wet fur clung in clumps, gleaming in the sunlight, suggesting it had just crossed the icy Toklat River or emerged from a shallow wallow. The bear was massive, easily over 500 pounds, and at first, it didn't notice the lone human nearby. But instead of backing away or calling for help, Richard White did what he had always done in moments like this. He dropped his pack slowly, reached for his camera with practiced hands, and began to do what he loved: capture the raw truth of nature through a lens. Frame after frame, Richard documented the bear's quiet movements. The animal showed no aggression. It wandered along the gravel bar, snout low, sniffing among the stones and willows. It didn't charge. It didn't growl. For 8 full minutes, as confirmed by the images recovered from his camera, Richard remained still, focused, and calm. The encounter seemed almost sacred. Two creatures sharing the same space, neither disturbing the other. But in the wild, peace is rarely permanent. Suddenly, something shifted. The bear stopped grazing. It raised its massive head and turned. The next few photographs became erratic. Blurred edges, tilted angles, a sudden disruption in the rhythm. It was as if Richard had stood or stepped back, the shot unsteady, the moment slipping. Then, nothing. The last photo was a disorienting swirl of brown fur, sky, and gravel, unfocused, haunting. That camera would be found later, partly buried under moss and dirt, its final image frozen, like a ghost's last whisper. What happened next could only be reconstructed by what was left behind. The bear closed the distance quickly, maybe out of instinct, maybe curiosity, or perhaps a sudden shift in the wind that triggered territorial aggression. But in that open stretch of Alaskan wilderness, without bear spray, without shelter, and without time to escape, Richard was overcome. There were no shouts heard, no mayday calls, just the rush of movement through brush, the snap of twigs under massive paws, and the silence that followed. By the next morning, August 25, 2012, the sun cast long golden shadows across the Alaska Range. At Denali's visitor center, a ranger glanced over the backcountry permit log. One name hadn't returned: Richard White, solo hiker, Unit 10. At first, it didn't seem like a crisis. Delays in the backcountry weren't unusual. Maybe his route had changed. Maybe his watch battery had died. But as hours ticked by, unease settled in like the creeping cold. No one had heard from him. No one had seen him. Most troubling of all, Unit 10 had recently logged a spike in grizzly activity. By late afternoon, a helicopter search team was deployed. They scanned the rocky riverbeds and narrow trails from the air, eyes trained for signs: a flash of fabric, a boot print in the gravel, anything. And then, around 4:30, about 3 miles from the nearest road, they spotted something odd. A backpack resting next to flattened tundra. Boots positioned unnaturally, as if abandoned mid-step. Just beyond that, a partially buried human form. Rangers sealed off the area immediately. This was no longer a missing person case. It was a death investigation, one with a predator still nearby. As boots hit the ground, rifles came out. The team advanced cautiously through the brush. Blood stained the moss in thick patches. The grass bore deep drag marks. The scene was fresh, raw, and unmistakably violent. Richard's camera lay nearby, silent and battered. His tent was torn. His final campsite had become a kill site. Rangers knew the bear could still be close. Every gust of wind carried the sour tang of danger. They moved slowly, whispered, helicopter blades thudded overhead, ravens cried out, circling, and then movement. North of the recovery site, near a stand of willows, about 200 yards away, a grizzly stepped into view. It was the same bear, broad, powerful, and unafraid. It didn't run from the sound of the chopper. It didn't cower beneath the rotors. It looked up, steady and sure, as if to say, "This is mine now." That one look was enough. Rangers confirmed this was the bear. Command was given. From the air, a ranger steadied his scoped rifle and fired. One shot echoed, then another. The bear collapsed without resistance. No roar, no charge, just a final breath and stillness. The animal that had ended Richard White's life now lay in the very brush it had claimed. When the recovery team reached Richard's body, the world around them fell into a deeper, heavier silence. It wasn't the wary hush of a predator stalking nearby. It was the stillness that lingers after violence when the threat is over, but the reality has only just begun to set in. The bear's body was flown out for necropsy, and what they found left no doubt. Inside the animal's stomach were traces that shattered any remaining hope of ambiguity. Scraps of synthetic fabric from Richard's jacket, pieces of his backpack, part of a tent, a lens cap. There were bone fragments, human tissue. This wasn't a defensive attack. It was a calculated kill, a case of deliberate predation. For the first time in Denali's history, a human being had not only been killed by a grizzly, he had been consumed. Richard hadn't been taken in a moment of panic or bad luck. He had crossed paths with a bear that made a chilling, conscious decision. The evidence was undeniable. The photographs from Richard's camera showed everything leading up to the encounter. The ground told the rest. And the grizzly's stomach bore the conclusion, final, irreversible, and cruel. Nature had spoken in its oldest language, instinct and survival. It gave no warning and offered no apology. The valley that Richard once called sacred was now painted with blood and shadow. Denali remained as breathtaking as ever, but something had changed. A man who revered the wild had become a victim of it, and the peace he had come seeking was replaced with silence, the kind you feel in your bone. The park fell into a strange hush in the days after the discovery. Not the usual quiet of wind and trees, but the kind of silence that follows an impossible question. How? How did this happen? That question echoed from ranger stations to newsrooms and across living rooms nationwide. Richard wasn't inexperienced, he wasn't careless. So how did a man so meticulous, so respectful of wildlife, become the first fatality of its kind in the park's history? The answers weren't easy. Wildlife experts combed through the photographs for clues. The bear showed no signs of stress or threat. It appeared calm, even disinterested, grazing along the gravel bar near mile marker 83. But in the wild, appearances can lie. A bear's behavior can shift in an instant. What seems peaceful can turn fatal. And Richard had unknowingly violated a critical rule. He was far too close. Park guidelines mandate a minimum distance of 300 yards from any bear. Richard had stood at just over 50. Maybe he misjudged. Maybe he inched forward for a better shot. Either way, to a bear, that wasn't a photo op. That was a challenge. He was alone. No backup. No one to shout or distract the animal. No bear spray. No second chance. It wasn't one fatal error. It was a series of small missteps. And in bear country, that's sometimes all it takes. At a press conference in Anchorage, park spokesperson Maureen McLaughlin stepped up to the podium, her voice steady but pale with grief. She delivered the words no one had ever needed to say before. It was the first fatal bear attack in Denali's history. And in that moment, the nation was reminded, wilderness is beautiful, but it is not benign. What triggered the attack? No one could say with certainty. Territorial instinct? Defensive reaction? A rare opportunity? The truth remains buried in that valley. In the stillness between one shutter click and the next, Richard White wasn't reckless. He was a man of faith. Faith in nature, in its rhythms, in its quiet mercy. But sometimes, the wild forgets to be kind. That day became a scar on Denali's timeline, a place once revered for its untouched majesty, now marked by tragedy. Richard had come searching for authenticity, for a glimpse of something real and unfiltered, and he found it. But it cost him everything. When rangers recovered his camera, they found it half buried near a tangle of broken willows, the lens cracked and strap torn. They powered it on, uncertain what they might see, and there it was, the final story told in still frames. Early shots captured the untouched beauty of Denali: open plains, golden-lit ridges, the soft shimmer of water through cottonwoods. Then the bear appeared, grazing, unaware. Then the shift, the angle tilted. The framing became urgent. The final image was a blur: brown fur, sky, gravel. An instant frozen in time just before the end. Those images became more than evidence. They became testimony, a wordless record of a man's final hour. When his family in San Diego was notified, grief hit like a wave. His daughter, only 19, said she'd always feared something like this might happen. Not because her father was careless, but because he trusted too deeply, because he believed the wild was good. Richard White believed, with quiet conviction, that if he honored the wilderness, it would honor him back. He thought there was a kind of sacred pact, an unspoken bond between man and beast, between stillness and survival. But nature doesn't sign contracts. It doesn't owe explanations or offer mercy. At his memorial weeks later in Anchorage, park rangers who had helped recover his body stood in respectful silence. Behind them, a screen flickered with his photographs, not of bears, but of subtler wonders: mist curling around tree trunks, moss on ancient stones, a lone red fox caught mid-step in the dawn light. He hadn't come for adrenaline. He came to bear witness to stillness. Messages poured in from across the country, some from strangers, others from fellow hikers who had once crossed paths with him in Yosemite, Glacier, or Sequoia. They remembered him as thoughtful, deliberate, and deeply observant. Brave, yes, but not in the performative sense. Brave in his quiet way of seeing. Again and again, one phrase surfaced: he died doing what he loved. His daughter said it through tears. His friends echoed it on tribute pages. Reporters used it in headlines. But beneath that comforting refrain was a harder truth, one that no amount of reverence could soften. He died because he was alone, because he crossed a line, literally and figuratively, because he didn't carry bear spray, because he believed, maybe too much, that love could protect him from nature's indifference. Park officials later began using Richard's story as a teaching tool. His final photographs, once intimate, now instructional, were shown at backcountry safety briefings, not to shame, but to warn. Grizzly bears are not photo subjects. They're not folklore. They're apex predators. And they do not care how gentle your heart is. A senior ranger who had flown in on the recovery mission said it plainly in the official report. Richard's photos were beautiful, but no image is worth a life. And still, the park trails saw new boots every season. Hikers came, photographers wandered off-path, but Richard White's name remained, a permanent echo in ranger logs, a quiet warning scrawled in the margins of maps and minds. Let his story be more than a tragedy. Let it be a reminder. Always carry bear spray, keep your distance, respect the rules, because they are written in the blood of those who came before. Never mistake quiet for safety. Never assume a calm bear means a harmless one. In Denali, silence is sacred, but it can also be fatal. Richard White's lens captured stillness, but his story now speaks to all who enter the wild. Reverence is not protection.